Hello, this is Elizabeth, and I'm here to tell you the story of two knights who were best friends and cousins, but who then quarrelled over the love of a princess. It was first told over 700 years ago by the English poet Geoffrey Chaucer, and it is the first story in his book known as the Canterbury Tales. In that version, it is known as the Knight's Tale. But I am going to tell you this story in the voice of the princess, Emelye. And that's why I've called this story Emelye's Tale. So now, let me hand you over to our heroine. Before I tell you my story, you should probably know a little bit about who I am and where I come from. My name is Emelye, Princess Emelye, and I grew up in the mountains of Greece, among the tribe of the Amazonian warriors. You may or may not know that there is one thing that makes us different from other people. Our society is made up solely of women. This meant that when I was little, I got to do all the things that normally only boys do, like sword fighting and shooting bows and arrows. And because we managed perfectly well without men, I never saw the point of them really. But this all changed one day when Duke Theseus arrived with his army of Athenian men. We fought the invaders with all our might, but in the end we made peace with them. To make sure that it was a lasting treaty, my sister, Queen Hippolyta, agreed to marry Theseus. Believe me, this was a big thing for an Amazonian queen to agree to do, but it was all in a good cause. And this is where my tale begins. We were approaching the gates of Athens, the city where Hippolyta and I would start our new life. But our way was blocked by a crowd of women from the city of Thebes. They were in mourning, veiled in black, and they threw themselves down on the ground in front of the army. We soon heard that they had come to ask the help of Theseus, for their city of Thebes had been invaded by a monster of a man called Creon, who had treated them with cold-hearted cruelty. Theseus hated injustice, and he led his men straight to Thebes, where he crushed the army of cruel King Creon. But just before he set off to return to Athens and finally have a slice of wedding cake, one of his men spotted two Theban knights lying on the battlefield. They were wounded, but still breathing, and from their coats of arms you could see that not only were they royal, but that they were cousins. They lay there in their chainmail, their olive skin turning pale as the blood drained from their faces. It was hard to tell them apart, with their jet-black curls and chiselled features. They could have been mistaken for brothers. If you did look closely, however, you might have noticed that Palamon, he was the elder of the two by half a year, had hazel eyes, whereas Arcite's eyes were a deep green. You may wonder how I could possibly know all this, given that I wasn't there, but we don't have time for that right now. Now, my brother-in-law, Duke Theseus, could be very stubborn at times, like he was in the pursuit of my sister Hippolyta. And in this instance, he was particularly stubborn, refusing to release the two wounded knights back to their people. Members of their families came in turn, offering the most elaborate gifts you could imagine, from horses to gold and jewels, and in desperation they even offered other relatives that perhaps they were less fond of, like Palamon's dopey younger brother. But Theseus was not moved. He commanded that the two young men be taken back to Athens, where they would be imprisoned until the end of their days. It was this decision that changed my life, although I didn't know it at the time, for I was only 13 when I left the Amazons with my sister and moved to Athens, city of theatre, music, philosophy, and men who did not always treat us Amazonian women with the respect that we were used to. I had to learn to be an Athenian lady under the watchful eyes of my teacher. But even though I was a princess, I got into trouble sometimes for beating up the boys around the palace when they were rude to me. I knew nothing of Arcite and Palamon, who passed their days chained to the wall in a dark prison cell. The only thing they had to look forward to were the times the jailer would take pity on them and unbolt their shackles. In these brief bursts of freedom, they could walk out of the shadows to the barred window on the far side of the room and gaze upon the world outside. Here they would see the grounds of the palace, its beautiful gardens, and beyond that the buildings of Athens, with its temple and theatre, all enclosed by the city walls. And although the view remained the same, they saw it shift from season to season as the years passed by in their cell. 3 years after they had first been imprisoned, I had my 16th birthday, and a great party was thrown for me. There was feasting and dancing, and the finest actors in all of Greece put on a hilarious comedy. After that, it was time for my birthday presents. Firstly, my sister had ordered a beautiful gown for me, embroidered with flowers stitched in gold and silver thread, and lined with a silk petticoat. Then it was Duke Theseus's turn to give me my birthday gift. Now I was 16, he said that I could have free reign of the palace grounds, and gave me a key to his private rose garden. Now I could go exploring on my own. One summer morning, as I was picking flowers in His Majesty's garden in order to make a garland to crown my golden hair, I was so happy that I began to skip along with my basket and sing to myself. I would never have done so had I known what would happen because of it, but at that point I was blissfully unaware. You see, on this May morning, as the sun was shining and a brilliant blue sky blazed over Athens, the jailer felt particularly sorry for his pale and weary inmates. First of all, he unchained Palamon, so that he could walk over to the barred window to see the daylight and world outside. The knight lowered his gaze to the rose garden below, trying to see if he could remember what roses smelt like. And who should he see but lovely royal me? I was skipping along with my blonde tresses flowing behind me as I danced and sang in the sunshine, and wearing my exquisite new gown. I must admit that I did look pretty splendid. Unable to speak or move his gaze, his jaw dropped open and he felt his heart pounding in his chest. As his eyes filled with tears, he let out a long sigh, which caused Arcite to look up out of the shadows. "Cousin," he said, "you do yourself no favours by sighing our captivity. It's our fate to be Theseus's prisoners. It was written in the stars the day we were born." To which Palamon replied, breaking from his momentary trance, "Arcite, you have no idea what I have just experienced. My heart is aching because I have just seen the most beautiful woman on earth. In fact, I don't think it was a woman, but Venus herself, the goddess of love." Which beats your average chat-up line. And then, closing his eyes, he prayed that Venus would take pity on them and release them from their chains. While Palamon was on his knees, Arcite pleaded with the jailer to unlock him from his chains so that he too could walk over to the window. I, all the while, was still picking flowers and had no idea that such an appreciative audience had gathered. Now, if the effect I had on Palamon sounded strange, you should have seen what happened to Arcite. I wish I had. He let out a heavy sigh and had to cling to the bars of the window to stop himself from collapsing, as his legs had given way. Some men really are made of no substance at all. "I think I'm dying," he said. "I am so struck by her beauty that if I cannot have her love and see her face every day, I won't be able to live." This enraged Palamon. He turned to Arcite and said, "Let me remind you, we are knights. We are cousins. We are sworn to be true to one another. How can you betray me this way and threaten to steal my love from me? Cousin, you know I would die for you in battle," said Arcite, "and would always remain true to you. But here I am the one who is injured. I have been shot through the heart with Cupid's arrow." "If you don't step down, as would a man with any decency, I'll have to fight you," retorted Palamon. But Arcite was in no mood to give up the love of his life, yours truly, whom he had just seen for the first time 2 minutes earlier. "I don't see why I should step down. After all, it was I who loved her first. You thought you had seen Venus, but from the moment I saw the vision of loveliness, I knew it was a young woman I loved. Therefore, she is rightfully mine. But let's not make rules for how we should love, but just accept that in this battle there are no rules." While they continued to argue, neither of them noticed that I had skipped back inside to the palace for my lunch. Here I met an honoured visitor, Prince Protheus, who had been friends with Theseus since childhood. I was sitting on the other side of the table, but I heard him say how he had come to Athens to plead for the release of a prisoner in the tower. He had trained this prisoner as a knight when he was a boy, and he had treated him like a second son. And Theseus, in honour of his long friendship with Protheus, promised to release the prisoner, whose name was Arcite. But he gave the order for Arcite's release on one condition. He must leave Athens immediately, never to set foot in the city again on pain of death. And was Arcite pleased by this news? I believe that he wasn't sure. The 2 cousins in the tower did not know who had the worst fate, for both were now possessed by an insatiable love for me. Yes, I know. But Palamon, although he could see me every day from the window of his cell, did not have the freedom to leave the tower and approach me, whereas Arcite had the freedom to go anywhere in the world he chose, but knew that if he set foot in the city where I lived, he would forfeit his life, and so would never see my face again. Or would he? And that was the first part of Emelye's tale. To find out what happens next to these 2 love-struck knights, look out for the next instalment of Emelye's tale at storynori.com. There will be 4 parts in all, and we promise to release them in quick succession. But for now, from me, Elizabeth, bye! Emelye's Tale, Part 2. Hello, this is Elizabeth. This is the second instalment of our adaptation of The Knight's Tale. If you listen to the last episode, you will know that the Theban knights, Arcite and Palamon, have both fallen head over heels in love with Princess Emelye. When we left them, Palamon remained imprisoned in a tower in Athens, while Arcite was banished from the city. And as before, the story is told in the voice of our heroine, Emelye. Poor Prince Arcite. He was now a free man, but his heart was still a prisoner of mine, actually, though I did not know it at the time. he returned home to Thebes, consumed with grief, for he longed to see me again. Every time he pictured lovely little me walking in the rose garden, his heart broke anew. He ached to return to his jail, where he could at least glimpse me from his window. I do not want you to think that I am conceited, but I do feel that I should let you know how much he suffered over his love for me. You see, he took on pining as a full-time occupation, and gave himself no relief in sleeping or eating, but instead would spend the day weeping and wailing. Then, for a change, he would lie awake all night, moaning and groaning over me. Enough to make any girl big-headed. One morning, he caught sight of his reflection in the mirror, and for an instant he didn't recognise the lank, pale, red-eyed man who shot a crazed glance back at him. It was this unsettling sight that inspired a plan. He would return to Athens, even though a sentence of death hung over his head there. He would not need any great disguise, for he was unrecognisable as his former self. Even better, if he dressed down like a servant, he could find a job in the palace and see me every day. And this is exactly what he did. Immediately, he set off for the city of Athens, where he went straight to the palace of Theseus and offered himself up for service. He said that his name was Philostrate, and no one had the slightest inkling who he really was. All who met him were impressed by his skill and dedication, and claimed that they had never come across such a refined servant. Meanwhile, he was regularly in my company in Theseus's court and at banquets, attending hunting parties and military drills. After 2 years of dutiful service, his diligence and charm had been noted by Theseus, who offered Arcite the greatest privilege possible for a servant, to become the king's squire. You may be wondering what has happened to Palamon during all this time, and so I shall fill you in. Fortune had not been so kind to this young knight. Although his cousin had been released, he remained imprisoned in the tower. Each day he waited for the morning hour where he might gaze upon me down in the rose garden. But when winter came, time passed slowly, as there was no sight of me to cheer him from his gloomy existence, and he missed the company of his cousin and sank into a deep depression. 7 years in total had passed in this pitiful way, when at last Palamon's luck took a turn for the better. He had befriended the young serving boy who brought him his daily rations, and the little boy had grown so fond of the wretched knight that he decided to help him escape. One summer evening, when the air was close and the amber glow of sunset spilled through the barred window, the little boy climbed the spiral staircase of the tower with a tray of supper for the jailer and his captive. He knocked on the prison door as usual, and the guard walked over to meet him. He grunted at the little boy as he took the tray, and let the iron door slam shut in his face. He had not noticed that the child's hands were shaking with nerves, so much so that the wine almost spilled from the goblets. The jailer slumped back in his chair and began to feast on roasted chicken legs, which he washed down with a goblet of wine. Palamon watched him intently from the dark corner of the cell where he was chained, careful not to touch any food that had been brought to him. Soon he noticed that the jailer was struggling to keep his eyes open. Thinking the drowsiness was brought on by the heat, the jailer took swig after swig of the thick red wine, but that only seemed to make him ever more drowsy, and there was a reason for this. The serving boy lived with his elderly aunt, who was considered the wisest old woman in Athens. She practiced medicine, and some people even believed she was a witch. From her, he stole a sleeping draught that was meant to be taken 1 drop at a time, and no more. He was not going to take any risks with his plan, and he mixed half a bottle of the sleeping medicine into the jailer's wine, which was why he was now passed out on the floor and snoring like a wild beast. Palamon watched the guard intently to ensure that he was really sound asleep. He could feel his heart racing in his chest and beads of sweat trickling down his brow. He tensed his hands and tried to slide them from their shackles. The knight was surprised to see how easily his wrists slid out of their bonds. During the 7 years of captivity, his once brawny arms had wasted through poor food, lack of exercise, and pining for me. The boy returned, and careful not to make a sound, he reached down to the sleeping man to unhook the keys. As fast as he could, he unlocked the door to Palamon's cell, and the knight swiftly thanked him for his freedom and darted down the spiral staircase of the tower. When he emerged from the tower, night had fallen, and he had to make his way in the dark along the pathways to the palace gates. Luckily, he had spent every day of his captivity looking out across the gardens, and so he knew the layout like the back of his hand. When he reached the gatehouse, there was nothing for it but to walk briskly past the guards, keeping his eyes down and not looking back. Fortune was on his side, as the guards were so engrossed in an arm wrestle that they didn't even notice him walking past. He walked on through the city streets, always afraid that someone was on his tail. But the Athenians he passed had no reason to suspect him, and just smiled or greeted him as they went about at their leisure on this pleasant summer's evening. Before long, he found himself on the road that led out of the city and nearing a forest. Weary from that evening's adventure, he decided to spend the night in the forest and continue his journey at dawn. He would return to Thebes, implore his comrades to wage war with him on Athens, and win me as his bride. How chivalrous! It is now time to return to the second of our nights, Arcite. For when dawn arrived, he had set out to stroll into the forest, as was his custom. Here he would find the privacy to drop his guise and sing of his love for me. But this young lover's mood was rarely constant, and once he had sung and danced, shouting his passion to the tops of the trees, he sank down against the trunk of an oak and let out a heavy sigh. He bemoaned the fact that he had given up his freedom and must serve Theseus to the end of his days, that he had lost his Theban birthright as a prince, that he would never be called by his own name again, at which point he sounded it out on his lips several times. But worst of all, he would never be considered a worthy candidate to be the husband of lovely me. Fate would have it that the privacy that he sought was not as private as he believed. For resting nearby in the grove behind the large oak was his cousin Palamon, who had been woken by Arcite's joyful singing. By listening to Arcite's speech, he discovered that not only did he have a rival in the suit of his beloved, me, but that his rival was his cousin. He learned that Arcite had enjoyed his freedom in my company, while Palamon had suffered the hardship of imprisonment. In a fury, he burst out into the clearing and grabbed Arcite by the throat. "Of all the greatest betrayals imaginable," he brayed, "you would try to steal my love while I was rotting in a prison cell. I will see you dead before I see you marry Emelye. I am unarmed, but I shall fight you all the same." You are a fool to believe that you alone have the right to love this girl. But let's settle this properly. Tonight I shall return to the grove with weapons enough for 2 men, and a duel at the break of day shall decide who is worthy of her love," replied Arcite. Not only were these 2 knights obsessed with me, but they were now ready to fight to the death over this obsession. At twilight, the young man returned with weapons and food and drink, so that both men could prepare themselves for the match that lay ahead. The next morning, as the first light of day crept in through the trees, they awoke and dressed each other in their armour, more like comrades in battle than opponents. The fight was long and furious, as thrust was met with parry and cut was cleared with block. All morning long they laboured in the struggle, until the sun had risen directly above the treetops. Now, it was customary for Duke Theseus to lead the royal hunting party on the last day of every week, for he believed that nothing tasted finer than meat killed by oneself. I detested such sport, but enjoyed riding along with my sister, Queen Hippolyta, not to mention that I had been made a green velvet hunting gown and matching hat that did look rather fetching. On this morning, we had not long entered the forest, mounted on our horses, with a pack of dogs, and the chief huntsman at the front with his horn, when we heard the clashing of swords and the heavy groaning of a fight to the death. Entering the clearing, we all gathered to see the 2 knights in the midst of a passionate duel. Theseus immediately rode up to the men. "Stop! Stop this brawling!" he cried out. "The next man who gives a blow shall be sentenced to death, I say." More out of sheer exhaustion than obedience, the knights halted their fight. "What is the cause of this quarrel?" Theseus demanded to know. Palamon spilled out the whole tale to the Duke, including the love they both felt for me, and Arcite's true identity. You can imagine how I was taken aback. I had received attention from men before, but this was far more extreme than a compliment at a party. On hearing Palamon's confession, Theseus was furious that he should have been deceived in such a way. Driven with rage, he sentenced both men to death. Now, Hippolyta and I knew that the Duke at times had quite a temper, but were surprised by his severity. I was overwhelmed by the fact that these 2 boys would lose their lives on account of loving me. It didn't seem right at all. And so I dismounted my horse and, joined by my sister, fell at the king's feet and begged him to lessen the knight's sentence. And that was the second part of Emelye's tale. If you would like to find out whether Emelye and Hippolyta's pleas will soften the heart of Duke Theseus, or whether Arcite and Palamon will be executed, you will have to return for the next episode at storynori.com. But for now, from me, Elizabeth, bye! Emelye's Tale, Part 3. Hello, this is Elizabeth, and I'm here with the third and final part of our story, Emelye's Tale. When we last left the story, 2 knights, Arcite and Palamon, had been sentenced to death by Duke Theseus, and Emelye and her sister Queen Hippolyta were desperately trying to save their lives. As we knelt before Duke Theseus, Hippolyta and I begged him not to execute the knights. "They may have been foolish," I pleaded, "but they don't deserve to die for it." The other women in the hunting party joined us. Even my annoying nurse Corinna began to cry. We looked on to see the Duke's expression turn from anger to pity. Our tears, it seems, had softened his hard heart. he spoke sternly to the knights. "You have both risked your freedom for this princess, and what is more, it seems that you are both prepared to sacrifice your lives for such a cause. A love like this is not easy to find, and for this reason, I would struggle to name two better candidates for Emelye's hand in marriage." This was not at all what I had expected. It was one thing not to want somebody to be killed, but it was quite another to be offered in marriage to these men. But which one was to be my husband? Duke Theseus ordered that so great a prize as me could not be decided in any old fight or brawl. He ordered that Arcite and Palamon must each gather 100 knights and fight to decide who would win me as his bride. The knights on both sides would take it in turns to fight a series of duels in one-to-one combat. Nobody was allowed to kill his opponent. Each man would fight only once, and should either Palamon or Arcite be wounded, his rival would immediately be declared the winner. I must admit that I found this overwhelming, to say the least. It was incredible to think that so much importance had been placed on a dispute over me. But to tell you the truth, it just might have been good manners, I thought, if somebody had asked me about it first. There may be some women who feel flattered by a war being fought over them. There was that Princess Helen, for whom they fought the Trojan War. But frankly, I'm not like her. From first light, the streets of Athens began to stir with excitement and anticipation. The day of the contest had arrived. The clamour of metal could be heard from the blacksmiths' workshops as they made the finishing touches to spears and horseshoes. Barrows of fresh fruit were wheeled down the lanes, and little boys ran in and out of the townsfolk riding on imaginary chargers. And as the sun rose, carriages travelled down the cobbled roads towards the palace, inside which sat lords and ladies dressed in their finery. As the people of Athens approached the palace, music played throughout the crowds on pipes and trumpets and horns and drums. Chatter filled the warm, sunny air as everyone wondered which knight would win me as his bride. At noon, Theseus appeared on the balcony of the palace and sat on his throne. Great cheers rang through the crowd of Athenians, and shortly afterwards they were parted by Theseus's guards to make way for the royal procession. The Duke rode in front, flanked by the 2 Theban knights. I rode behind with my sister Hippolyta, and I received so many cheers that I felt like a conquering hero. Women threw flowers in front of us, and children waved as music and drumming blasted through the air. We were the first to enter the stadium, and were seated at the royal podium overlooking the arena, from which hung purple and gold banners with the Athenian coat of arms. Meanwhile, the knights' armies had gathered outside the opposing entrances. Arcite led his men through the western gate, his ruby-red banner held high as they passed the temple of Mars. Palamon entered through the eastern gate, brandishing a white banner as they passed the shrine to Venus. Both armies were equally magnificent. The men set themselves in position, 100 on each side. As the trumpet was blown, I held my breath, unsure if I would be able to watch the fighting. Never in my life had I felt such a rush of excitement and fear. As the first pair charged towards one another, blinding beams of sunlight reflected from their suits of armour. With a clean strike, Palamon's man was thrown clear from his horse, which continued to run around the arena until its reins were seized by an attendant. The challenges came thick and fast. As quickly as a new pair of riders charged at one another, another defeated man was carried off to the post where his wounds were nursed. The first of the royal knights to compete was Palamon, who looked magnificent in his silver armour, mounted high on a white horse. He was challenged by Arcite's man Emetreus, the king of India. The men passed one another several times, each attempting to strike the other with sufficient force to throw him from his horse. But every blow that was struck was met with a parry of equal strength. It was not a blow that decided the victor of this duel, but a tactical manoeuvre. While the men were passing, after an unsuccessful strike from King Emetreus, the Indian king turned back to make a second cut, and caught Palamon unawares, piercing his flesh. Although the wound was deep, Palamon found the strength to attack Emetreus with one final blow that threw him from his saddle. In spite of this small victory, the rules stated that a man with serious injuries must be removed from the conflict, and his opponent declared the victor. Devastation swept over Palamon, as he realised that he had lost the competition, and forfeited his right to marry me. Theseus stood from his throne to declare the contest over, and that a winner had been found. The crowd roared so loudly that the stadium seemed to shake. Arcite was riding a lap of victory around the arena, and removed his helmet, tossing it high up into the air. The crowd cheered with delight as the knight's face was revealed, and his jet-black curls were swept back as he rode. What happened next is certainly the strangest and most terrible thing I have ever witnessed. Suddenly, a thick cloud passed in front of the sun, casting a shadow over the arena. And from this shadow, that covered the dusty ground, rose up what can only be described as a spirit, transparent, and yet seeming to have a face. There was no doubt that this ghostly being had made its way up from Hades. So afraid was Arcite's horse that it reared up, throwing the Theban knight to the ground. He fell badly, and without a helmet to protect him, received a great blow to the head. The atmosphere among the thousands of spectators switched in an instant from jubilation to horror, as the newly found victor now lay on the ground, struggling for his life. Arcite was carried back to the palace, where he was laid on a bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. Theseus, in an attempt to raise the morale of his people, issued an announcement that Arcite was not mortally wounded and would recover. He then drew the Athenians' attention towards those knights whose wounds were being attended at the side of the arena, telling them to rejoice in the fact that no man had lost his life that day and all would be well. Theseus assured everyone that there was no cause for jealousy or anger between the two sides. Praise and glory were owed to both equally, and every combatant would receive a prize from the Duke. While these prizes were being handed out, Hippolyta and I rode back to the palace to see how my newly acquired fiancé was faring. As we entered the corridor that led to the chamber where Arcite lay, I saw Palamon pacing outside the doorway, consumed with worry. He said that there was nothing that the doctor could do for him. An attendant came out of the room and told us that Arcite wanted to see us both. Approaching his bed, he appeared so much smaller and meeker than the mighty warrior I had first seen. His face had turned yellow, and his lips were pale. With great effort, he reached for my hand, and looking me in the eyes, he spoke. "Emelye, whatever wounds you see in my body, they are nothing compared to the hurt to my heart when I thought I would never talk to you and make you mine. But I want you to know that there isn't a man alive more deserving of your love than my noble cousin Palamon." I was surprised to hear these words. I assumed that they would remain rivals to the bitter end. But should I have been surprised? They were both knights, and their code of chivalry and honour meant more to them than life itself. Looking back with time, I can see now that I should not have been proud that they fought over me, but I am rightly proud that they were reunited in my name. Arcite clenched my hand tightly, and then closing his eyes, with a deep sigh moaned my name. Emelye. And with that final breath, the last ounce of life departed from his body. Overwhelmed with sadness, I began to cry, and was led away by my sister. Theseus found a fitting place for Arcite's grave. He remembered the woodland grove, where Arcite would visit when he was serving as the Duke's loyal squire. There he sang and rejoiced in his love for me. And so Theseus decided that would be the perfect place to lay his body to rest. Several mighty oaks were felled to build Arcite's funeral pyre, as a result of which the women and children whispered that many nymphs and fairies had been seen in the woods, dislodged from their homes after the cutting of the trees. A cloth made of the finest gold covered the young knight's body. No one present could restrain their tears on such a sad occasion. I was given the torch to light the pyre. Once I had lighted the fire, I stood back from the burning mound, and overwhelmed by the heat, I fainted into my sister's arms. For the next few days and weeks, I could not rid my thoughts of the final image of the dying man. I had had no idea of how much suffering I had caused him. It was only when he compared his heartache to the physical pain that I had seen him endure that I began to see how sad his story was. I then became tormented by feelings of guilt and pity. Palamon also sank into a great depression at the loss of his cousin, and could be seen taking long and solitary walks around the palace grounds, his mind lost in thought. Theseus and Hippolyta were sorry too, when they saw us both in such a sad state, and so decided that perhaps we might be of comfort to one another. Over the months that followed, Palamon was invited to join us on several occasions. He dined in Theseus's quarters, went on the royal hunt, and attended the theatre festivals and games. As time went on, he became a great companion of mine, for his wit excelled anyone I had ever met, and with time our tears were exchanged for smiles and laughter. It was on the eve of my next birthday that Duke Theseus invited all his royal courtiers to dine, and once they had all gathered, he began to address the court. "My lords and ladies, it fills me with great pleasure that you join me on such a joyous occasion, the birthday of our beloved Princess Emelye. All of you will know that the events of the past year have offered us little to celebrate, but cast a great shadow over the harmony of our city. But I say to you, the death of a young warrior bestows upon him the greatest honour imaginable, for he has left this life at the height of his fame. Never will his reputation fade with the arrival of old age. And so, let us drink to the memory of the Theban prince Arcite." As he raised his glass, the hall of guests rose to their feet, and raising theirs echoed, "To Arcite." "But let us turn to happier thoughts," he continued. "Over the past few months, I have seen a beautiful friendship blossom between two lost souls, and I believe that now that they have found each other, they wish never to part." At this, I felt my cheeks blush. Yes, it is true that the more time I spent with Palamon, the more I thought about him, to the point where he was always on my mind. And when we were separated, even for a day, nothing could beat the first moment when I saw him again, and he would look up at me, and I would feel butterflies in my stomach. And when we were together, I felt complete. It was effortless talking to him, and sometimes we would just sit in silence, which after a while he would break with a smile. But I had no idea that Theseus and Hippolyta had noticed this. Clearly, my secret love wasn't so secret after all. And I have to say that it was a true love that grew by itself. It wasn't love at first sight. I did not fall, like any old storybook princess, for the first knight who came along on his horse. I got to know him first. And let me tell all you girls out there that are dreaming of a handsome prince who will sweep you off your feet one day. Don't just fall for looks and charm, because true love is based on true friendship. And of course, it was so much better that the Duke ordered us to get married only after we had fallen in love, instead of expecting it all to happen the other way around. We were married the following month, and now live in our own quarters. I know this may all come as a surprise to you, that I, Emelye, once an Amazonian princess, might actually enjoy married life, but never could I have wished for a better companion. And so I am now living happily ever after with my knight in shining armour. And that is the end of my tale. I have to leave you now, as we're going out for a ride in the woods. And that was the final part of Emelye's tale, adapted from the Chaucer by me, Elizabeth Donnelly. I hope you enjoyed it. Visit us again soon at storynori.com. But for now, from me, Elizabeth, bye!